We're looking at 6 things that Mary Oliver in her book, A Poetry Handbook, has told us to avoid if we're trying to make our poems better, if we're trying to be better poets. Let us take a look at our third one. The third point that Mary Oliver brings up is the idea of inversion. Take a look at this poem and tell me, what does inversion mean?
Through winds so cold, my heart doth stray. So it's through the winds that my heart strays.
So you find this line a little bit confusing?
Yeah.
Structural? Okay. More inversion?
Is it more like just the structure of the sentence itself? Like,
It is.
like it's just like a complicated way to say it when you could just say it, you know?
Disruption of the syntax. I don't remember the part of speech, but instead of in dreams of light, I find my way. I find my way in dreams of light.
Exactly.
Yeah.
My heart doth stray through wind so cold, it does seem a world of shadows. Cards, the stars do gleam beneath the moon.
Kind of like Yoda.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. So why do poets do this? We've seen
Sound
poets do
intelligent.
this. I'm sorry?
Sound intelligent.
For
Rhyme
to
structure.
think of it. Rhyme.
Sounds musical almost.
I think the big thing you see this is in poets that rhyme.
Yeah, I do
You,
it all the
you see
time.
this. You see this in rhyming poems. Why do we do this in rhyming poems? It's because if I write it the normal way, the rhyme's not going to work. Because
Right.
the rhyme's going to be in the first half, but I need it in the second half. So what do I
You
do?
hit
Let me
the
just.
chord beat, not
Yeah,
the
it's like
sentence.
I'm going to have ions, but I need trochees. Like you know, there's all these things going in it. So the end result
Reminds
is
me of
this.
this Nas song I once heard.
I'm sorry.
Reminds me of this Nas song I once heard. It's called Rewind. The whole rhyme was him telling the story backwards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good one.
You know, I think there's one you're doing with intentionality versus doing it to force a rhyme, which I
Yeah.
think is one of the biggest culprits. Irvin, you mentioned some of your poems are like rhyming ones. I've heard it.
Right.
Um,
They're pretty much all are.
so what do we think of this?
I think it can be a good thing if used sparingly, like, and especially in a way if you can like work it into like a double entendre.
Okay.
But if you're using it like every time as like a cheat code, then it's cheap. And it's, you know,
I think it's a good way to tell a story.
I think a word of caution, I would say, because I definitely lean with Mary in terms of this is in general. You know, all rules can be broken in the right situation, but I think in general, it's not my first option. It's not my plan A.
right.
I'm going to try to find a plan A, and if nothing else is going to work, maybe I'll do this, but maybe it's going to be even better to just not do it at all. And just like leave the thing out. I don't know. Like it can be very difficult to incorporate in a way that sounds natural because it just,
It doesn't flow from the lips.
You know?
It's like,
it's very disjointed.
It also feels like very, so like in Romeo and Juliet, like not even in like the play, or like not in the written out play, but like in Romeo's poem to like his ex or something like that. It sounds like that, right? So it's like this very sing-songy kind of, you know, writing this like kind of, which I think that style of writing, it's very hard to contemporize. It's very hard to probably match whatever you're writing about right now. And so, you know, just as much as what you're writing about in its content, you want to reflect like what you're like the times or whatever you're writing about. So it's like that's like if I'm like, oh man, I had a rough day at work driving my 2002 Toyota Corolla or something like that. It's like that, like I'm listening to that, and that feels very like Elizabethan, you know, old timey.
It's very anachronistic, right? It doesn't, it feels very disconnected from the world we live in right now. And you're not fooling anybody. People know what you're doing. We know that you don't know how to rhyme, so you have to do this, you know? So be careful with this device.
Yeah.
That's all I'm going to say. Just be careful, especially if you know you're doing it. Not to name names. That's number 3. We're halfway done. We got 6. Here's our next one. The 4th thing that Mary Oliver identifies for us is something called informational language. Take a moment to read through this and tell me, what does informational language mean? What is the meaning of informational language?
I'm gonna say it's straightforward, just you give out information about the subject.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So in this particular case, I don't know what any of that stuff means. So whoever write it is writing it, I'm gonna say from their perspective, and they're trying to give information to the audience maybe to help them understand it maybe. So it's just like, I mean, they're probably gonna lose their audience if the audience is there who they don't know what they're talking about. But it looks like the person's trying to inform them of what they are talking about. But so it can get a little confusing depending on the audience.
Right.
Like me, that's like me if I was writing a poem about building a computer, but I'm talking to people who don't even know what a 60 FPS is or high frame rate or
Right.
fidelity, they will be
It's
lost.
like overly specific on the details.
Overly specific on detail. I like that. Other thoughts on informational language?
It's fun sometimes, even if you know you're gonna lose the audience, because you know sometimes it's not for them, it's for you. Like in a way.
Or it's for that specific audience. Like, I think that's an important thing with audience. I think a lot of times we don't think about audience for
Right.
work enough. There's almost like this idea, we're writing for everybody. It's like, you're never writing for everybody.
Yeah, you can't, like, it's impossible.
You know, there are people that could read this and maybe get something
right, that would
out of
enjoy
it and enjoy it, you know.
Oh,
So
I relate to that. I like working with words.
So I feel like we almost have to kind of put that stipulation in that, like, assuming, you know, audience aside,
Right.
I think some of the issues that we mentioned here with the informational languages, it doesn't, it can not even feel like you're reading a poem. It can feel like you're
Yeah.
reading an instruction manual,
Yeah.
right? Besides, this was the best chat GPT could do. Okay, like it's not going to be like the best
No, I just
example.
I think it's about the concept. I think that there's like a. I do think so. You have to put that qualifier though. It's like, okay, if you're not respective to like audience, if you're like, okay, well, if you're making the attempt to appeal to even a greater amount of people, maybe. But I'm like, it also depends on, you know, what is the subset? What is your goal with, like, if you have a specific goal, like I want this poem to relate to this audience or this audience or this audience, then maybe something like this is not going to be as well received. I do think that there is an audience that so this feels like, you know, naturally probably an excerpt from a poem as opposed to a poem itself. And so to me, I would be like, I don't know what context that this might land in, but there might be a context where like this seems like out of reach for the layman, you know what I mean? It feels like out of reach for the layman. But it's like there's plenty of poems that like they have sections or they have things that are, if you took out of context, you're like, okay, I'm not gonna really understand that. But because there might be some adventure in a little bit of research, or there might be just some adventure in being like, you know, what can I get from this from context? So it's like, it just depends on what you want from that poem. Because, you know, I'm sure there's other subsections. It's like, you know, if you're an anime fan, if you're a Star Trek fan, if you are somebody who works specifically on water purifiers, that like if you're writing a poem about water purifiers, it's like maybe there's but it's like maybe there's things about this specific subject that it's gonna feel inaccessible to most people, that you're gonna be able to lock in like somebody that works on air purifiers or just knows a lot of it. Like man, look at this deep.
Right.
And like maybe you're fine with that.
Like, I think even looking at this, like, this is not the ideal example I had in mind for technical. I think the last line starts to get there a little bit, like, then Torque will suspect, like, that line is a bit heavy. I think there's ways that, I think we've had sections where, I see this a lot, for instance, with prose poems. A lot of people writing prose poems, and they're like, I'm trying to write a prose poem, but it ends up being prose. And I think part of the reason that often happens is we know too much, we get too deep into the specific details, and so we start adding in the information that leans more into prose, because prose you can get into that really rich description in a lot of ways, but a lot of times poems aren't able to get to that certain level of specificity to that same degree over the same amount of time, you know? And so I think it's a balance. Like, for instance, here, I think there's elements, like if I were working on this, there's elements I would make keep, but there's also price and I'll say, you know, we could probably adjust some of these details a little bit to just tone it down slightly.
I feel like the name of that poem is like cabinets.
Cabinets. My cabinets.